Hello, my name is Heather Lennon, and I'm the president of the Lancaster Historical Society. And I'd like to welcome you here today for the third in an installment of programs that we are doing on Lancaster's prominent Thayer family. So I'm going to start with the program today that's called The Red House, and I do hope you enjoy it. And I will begin right away with our presentation. All right, here we are at the first screen. Today's presentation is a continuation of a couple programs I had previously done, beginning with the first generation and the Dr. Reverend Thayer, who came to Lancaster back in 1793. And the family had four generations and had a lot of prominence in the town during those four generations. In fact, there still is a Thayer presence in Lancaster today. However, most of them after the fourth generation had moved away and established lives other places. So we're going to call this one the Red House on the Hill. And if you've driven around in Lancaster or have lived here for a long time, you may say, what house? What red house on the hill? So anyway, you're not far off because there really is no more red house on the hill. This is one of the houses that was demolished several years ago after the family had left town, but I'll explain that soon. Okay, here we are in South Lancaster on the main street, probably familiar to most of you in your daily travels. And on the left-hand side of the road, you have a building that is today the Atlantic Union Conference Building, and that was erected back in the mid-1960s. It's on a fairly flat parcel of land, you'll notice. But if we go back in time to the very same location at the end of the 19th century, in the early years of the 20th century, and we're in the same spot, you can notice quite a different look. The road is unpaved. The road is also lined with beautiful elm trees, which were once the pride and joy of Lancastrians. And then we have a hill moving upward, sloping upward on the left-hand side of the screen. And that's the hill where the house had formerly stood. And this, I wish were in color. It's not, but if it had been in color, you would see that the house was painted a red all over. And it's a high Victorian style house. I believe it was probably built in the last half of the 19th century. We don't know exactly when. And here in another view, you can see the house more completely. It has the towered and turreted look of a late Victorian house. And I do wish we had pictures of the interior, but we do not. On the west side, that would be facing toward the Langen Road, there is a wonderful view of the Intervale, and it was a beautiful location to put a house. So well placed. Here's another picture of the house as it was viewed from the main road back in the day to give you a better idea of the orientation of the building. You see they had a long sloping driveway, upward moving, and in the middle there, you can barely see it, but there's a porte-cochere, front porch entrance where you would arrive in your horse-drawn carriage. And here's a more recent 1910 view of that same house. You can see it's still in the time period when it was immaculately kept by the family. This house, I do believe, was built for Nathaniel Thayer III, and he was the eldest son of Nathaniel II, who made the family fortune. And then after occupying that house for a few years, I do believe he moved on and inherited what is today the Thayer Conservatory of Music, which would have been his father's house. His father had passed away in 1883, but his widow lived on until 1897. So that's probably when the transfer of the house took place. And of course, as we will find out, this house was occupied by Nathaniel III's three daughters. So we'll move ahead with this. And I'll talk a little bit more, review about Nathaniel Thayer III. He was the eldest son of the fortune maker and inherited his father's business and carried on with the family traditions. Being the eldest one, he had to take the responsibility and lived a rather short life, having passed away at the age of 59. But anyway, we'll go back to the time he married. He married Cornelia Street Barrel. She was from a fairly well-known family in Baltimore, Maryland. The marriage took place there. Then he brought his bride back to Boston and, of course, also to Lancaster. And they started their family and had three daughters. And most unfortunately, during the birth process of the third daughter, his wife passed away. She died, and she is buried in the family plot in Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge. And you can see at the bottom of this slide, her name is inscribed on the family tomb. And of course, Mr. Thayer then had three daughters with no motherless daughters, and he didn't hesitate very long before he married again. So on June 11th of 1887, he took for his second wife a woman by the name of Pauline Revere. And we know from her last name that she was related to some very famous characters from American history. She was, in fact, the great-granddaughter of Paul Revere. And that family was not a particularly wealthy family, but they did have a very prominent name. And on the other hand, Mr. Thayer had a lot of wealth and was on the upward swing, the upward mobility move from his side of the family. So the marriage was a good one. She had a name of prominence and he had money. And she turned out to be quite an enterprising woman in her own regard with regard to philanthropy. And here she is with her three small daughters, and we'll take a closer look right here. The young stepmother with her stepdaughters. From left to right, we have Cornelia, the eldest. She was known as Nina, and this name Cornelia is repeated several times throughout the family generations in Thayer history. So anyway, we've got Nina, and on the stepmother's lap, on Pauline's lap, we have Sarah or Sally. She's the one that had her mother pass away when giving birth. And then the child on the right-hand side is the middle child, and her name is Anna. So those are the three daughters. And we know that Pauline was an especially devoted and attached stepmother throughout the lives of her three stepdaughters. And in fact, amongst the Thayers of Lancaster, she was looked upon as a veritable Cupid in disguise for her charming stepdaughters as well as for her pretty nieces. And this would be very much in keeping with the Brahmin way of life because they always sought to marry within their class. So I imagine Pauline felt quite comfortable doing a little matchmaking here and there to do the very best for her stepdaughters, so they would marry well in life and be able to hold up the Brahmin way. Pauline, in fact, was so devoted that at one point in her life, she decided she'd take the family on a grand vacation. So she rented a hall. This is called Hill Hall. It's in Epping, England, which is about 50 miles away from the city of London, famous in its own regard as a part-time home for some of the British royalty from time to time over the past 400 years. But anyway, as the Thayers remember it, they remembered it not only as Hill Hall, but also Hell Hall. Now, a word about that. When the family arrived, they arrived in different contingents and finally were all assembled there together. When they'd have their dinners in the evening, there could be as many as 21 persons. And some of them were folks that were brought in through second marriages. And so there were steps involved. And as you probably can imagine, some of the steps got along well. Others were a little bit more rocky in their relationships with the steps. Not always a smooth thing to deal with. Here's a picture of Grandma Thayer at this very vacation spot here in Epping, England, and she is pictured on the far right. And in the background here at the very top, she has her three son-in-laws. And then we have her eldest stepdaughter, Cornelia, Nina. Then we have Anna. And then we have Sally, the youngest one. And on the bottom, we have an array of part of the group, part of the grandchildren. And on Anna's lap, there's a little boy there named Arthur, which was her youngest child. Now we're going to start the story with the eldest daughter. Her name was Cornelia van Rensselaer Thayer Moltke. They always had to keep that van Rensselaer name in the line of succession with naming their children. They were very proud of the New York Van Rensselaer connection. Anyway, here she is. And I want to say that her marriage took place in Lancaster back in June of 1907. And her groom was none other than the Danish Count von Moltke, as you can see in the newspaper headline on the left. And on the right-hand side, I want to point out that she's very beautifully attired in a Danish traditional dress. So she was becoming a countess. And here they are, once again, the Countess Nina on the left and her groom. Her groom was a bit older than she was. And it's interesting that in this case, it may have been the situation where he had the title and she had the money. But nonetheless, it was considered a good match and a long-lasting match. And here they are a few years later in 1910, Karl von Moltke and his beautiful young regal-looking bride. And here they are on a ship. I don't know whether they're coming or going on a European tour or what the occasion was, but they're pictured there with their first and only child. His name was Carl Adam, and this picture was taken in 1912. And when the Count married the Countess, he took her to Denmark, and they procured a home in a very fashionable neighborhood, a resort area near Copenhagen. And this place was called Klampenborg. And he purchased this place back in 1914. Very appropriate residence. And here it is as pictured in 1991, remodeled. You can see that it still has that beautiful setting, and the interior is painted in a beautiful white color with a large mirror and fireplaces and such. Very fitting for the couple. Here she is in midlife at the age of 43. She was known for her beauty in the family, and she also took her responsibility. I believe she probably modeled her behavior on her stepmother Pauline's behaviors, because she was a leader in many good causes. And here she is with her husband and her son, Bobby Moltke. Carl Adam was later known as Bobby Moltke. We'll talk more about him in a little bit. And his father, looking a bit older, with Nina in the center. And here she is with Winston Churchill. This is after World War II, about 1948 or 9. And if you look closely, she is wearing a medal that was given to her as a recognition for her work in the Red Cross, which would be one of the causes she would have espoused back in the day of the war. And here she is. I love this picture, the pose with her fingers lightly resting on her chin, and it looks like a drink of some sort in her hand, enjoying a good conversation with another Winthrop relative there. That Winthrop relative, Ruth Richards Bean. And here she is again. And below her in this photo, there is or this slide, I should say, is a quotation from her, which I think is well worth repeating. She said, "It doesn't matter how one dies, as long as one lives up to the highest standard one has been able to set for oneself." So you can tell that she was a woman who aspired to achieving wonderful things. And now I want to introduce you to her granddaughter. Her granddaughter's name is Alexandra Moltke Isles. I believe she's still living, probably in the New York City area, not sure. But she is instrumental in telling parts of the family story. And interestingly enough, she began her life career as a young actress back in the 1960s. She was the first Victoria Winters in a soap opera, a Gothic soap opera that was entitled Dark Shadows. So she was the first Victoria Winters in the series, and this was during the years 1966 to 1968. And as an older woman, a few years later, decades later, she stayed in the business of producing products for public viewing by producing a program that was called The Power of Conscience. And she was a director in this case. She directed this in connection with the Danish government, and it had to do with the effort to protect the Jews during the time of Hitler's onslaught toward Denmark during World War II. And her father, Bobby Mulkey, who you had seen in a couple pictures previously, was actually a courier who would do runs between London and Denmark in behalf of this effort to protect the Jews. So this is a very important part of their family life that's preserved in that documentary. Now, I'm going to talk about that middle child. Here she is on the left-hand side. Her name is Anna Morton Thayer Patton Davies completely. You can see her as a child there, and then as an adult. She did have a long life, 80 years long, and we'll talk about some of the important events in her life now. First, I want to talk about the grandfathers. Anna's grandfather was none other than Nathaniel Thayer II, the fortune maker. And then on the other side of the slide here, we have Horatio Hollis Honeywell. He was also a grandfather, and to a man that Anna would marry. Anna would marry a young man named Willie Samuel Patton, and he was a grandson of Horatio Hollis Honeywell. So the two grandfathers must have been immensely pleased to have the marriage between the two houses, very much in the Brahmin tradition. And of course, they both had a great interest in horticulture. And as I had mentioned in our previous part 2, I believe it was, Honeywells were interested in the propagation of the rhododendron plant in America. They came from the plant came from the Orient. And during the marriage time, about the time that Anna married Willie, you can see at the homestead in Lancaster, numerous rhododendron plantings. So they must have had some common interest between the two houses. All right, now I want to mention once again a particular quotation. The Thayers may have their Lancaster and the Storrows their Lincoln and all the rest their favorite bits of domain, but we Apleys, Bromfields, and Calders know they are not Milton. So anyway, this apparently was written in a fictional work called The Late George Apley, but it points out the idea that the Brahmin class always had their expensive homes in Boston, in town. But then for retreats or vacations or holidays, they would always want to have one particular designated town they would go to where their country homes or cottages were located. And the Thayers were no different, and neither were the Honeywells, very much in keeping with the Brahmin traditions and ways of life. So here we have the Honeywell estate. It's pictured there at the top left. And it was one of many of the mansions in the town of Wellesley, Massachusetts. The Honeywell, so to speak, owned Wellesley. And down below, you see a picture in postcard form of the gardens. They were extremely interested, as I had previously mentioned, in horticulture. Now, here's the young couple on the steps of what is today the Thayer Conservatory of Music. Back in this day, it was called the Homestead. They married in June of 1904. Started their life together. We've got Willie there on the left, just a little bit, maybe 10 years older than Anna. And then we have the young bride, the middle child, Anna. And I want to say just a little bit about William S. Patton, who married her. He was an overseas contractor. He was sent to Russia in 1915-16, and then later he went to France to work for the Red Cross. So he had some overseas experience and connections that he gained from having been over there. Together, the couple had 4 children. They're listed below. We've got Nancy, Jean, William Jr., and then Arthur Nathaniel Patton, who is that young boy sitting on the lap, on his mother's lap. So I want you to remember that little detail because I'll speak about Arthur soon. Here's a picture of William Samuel Patton at his estate on Carver Hill, which is part of the Honeywell complex down there in the Wellesley area of Massachusetts. And he's attired in his fancy clothes with his top hat and his beautifully groomed horse. So you can see that this is a formal picture of life out there in the country. And here's that house again in Lancaster, the red house. We do know for a fact that the William Patton family did live in this house for a period of time. It was their primary residence for a few years in the early 1900s. And here are those children, the four children of Anna and Willie. First one, Nancy Patton DeVoe. She happened to marry a Groton professor. And I know from reading up on her that she lived her later life out in Western Massachusetts. And then we have her sister, whose name was Jean Honeywell Patton. And while Anna had a good relationship with Nancy, she had a very rough relationship with her daughter, Jean. And there are some reasons for that. Let me explain. Jean had gone over to Rome or to Italy to study or on a trip. And while she was there, she met a member of the Papal Guard. And she happened to fall in love with a young man and they wanted to marry. Well, she was an Anglican. Of course, the Papal Guard was a Catholic. Anna, her mother, was completely infuriated by this turn of events, and she really would have nothing to do with her daughter, Jean. It was a very rocky, very difficult relationship, to say the least. In fact, when the young woman married, it was her grandmother, Pauline, who was the one who provided the wedding breakfast for the young bride. She went to Italy. I'm not sure if she ever came back to live in the United States or not. Unfortunately, more research would need to be done to find that out. All right, now the two younger boys in the family. There's Anna reading to her son, Billy. Billy was born about 1909, and he was always a very frail and sickly child. And quite honestly, he was Anna's favorite son, or favorite child, I should say. She doted on him. She was worried about him. He was the center of her life. On the other side, we have that young child, Arthur, who was sitting on his mother's lap when they had that vacation trip to Hell Hall in England. Arthur was somewhat of a mischief. Apparently, the story goes that the family was seated around the table, and Arthur decided what he would do is have a little fun. And he took a spoon, filled it with oatmeal, and aimed it directly at Uncle Fred Winthrop. This is his step uncle, Fred Winthrop's eye. And his aim was pretty darn good because it hit the mark. And this kind of put Frederick Winthrop over the top. He was not pleased with that having happened. And as you can tell, the little boy established a reputation for being a mischief, and I'm sure he was quite a handful for his mother to deal with. And in his later life, from what I can determine, he lived in Western Massachusetts in the town of Stockbridge, although he's buried in Lancaster. Here's the frail child, Billy, with bagpipes. One of his horses there, just a nice little picture. And we have Anna here, picture it again. Her marriage with Willie Patton lasted for 23 years. William Patton died back in 1927. She became a widow. And at some point, she decided that she would move her residence to Lenox, Massachusetts. And you can see on the right-hand side a little anecdotal detail, the door. It is said that she brought one of her doors from Lancaster, and I'm assuming that this is from the Red House. So that's just a little bit of trivia. Anna was able to bring something of Lancaster out there to Lenox. And here is the home she purchased and occupied out in Lenox called Edgecombe. Very well kept and very immaculate looking in the day. I do believe that Anna made some alterations to the house to suit her own tastes over the years. And then she decided she would marry again, and she married the Right Reverend Thomas Frederick Davies, who's pictured in his religious attire there on the right. And apparently they knew each other socially from some time in the past. He himself had never married previously. He was 58 years old. And they married in 1930, just 3 years after her first husband's decease. But the marriage was short because the Reverend Davies passed away of a heart attack just 6 years later in 1936. Once again, back to the story of Billy Patton. There he is as a young man, probably approaching college age. And from what we know, he was not a particularly good student at Harvard, not academically. However, he did have a special gift for befriending people. People liked him, he bonded with them, and he developed many relationships which were lifelong relationships. And then on the right-hand side, at some point, he met a beautiful young woman whose name was Susan Mary Jay. And she was of the Jay family from the American history founding fathers. Her ancestor was John Jay, who George Washington had appointed as the very first Supreme Court Justice of the United States. So she was an old Yankee blue blood herself. And these two young people met and they decided that they would marry. You can see she was always considered a beauty, had a wonderful figure, beautiful for showing off clothing. She worked for Vogue magazine, both as a model and as a writer. One incidental story she told is about coming to meet Anna, her future mother-in-law, out there in Lenox. And it was a little bit frightening. I think it actually put Susan Mary back a bit because when they got to the front door and they were in the foyer, there was a staircase. And she saw this tall, shadowy figure coming down the staircase. And the figure was attired in glowing, glimmering black colors and about 6'1" tall. So this was Anna Morton Thayer Patton, her future mother-in-law. So anyway, she likened it to the fall of the House of Usher, and she said that the future mother-in-law, Anna, greeted her with all the warmth of an iceberg. So then she goes on to say, of course, later on after dinner, Anna loosened up a little bit and maybe was a little bit more approachable, but that first impression never left her. Here is Susan Mary Patton holding her son, Billy again, Billy III, there in 1948, looking very glamorous with her newborn baby. And here's a picture of Anna, the grandmother, there in France back in 1950. So we've got Anna on the right and her son, Bill Patton, and then his son, Billy. And Anna then was an elderly woman. She died in 1953 at the age of 80. So she was near the end of her life when she was over there in France. And then she's buried in Lenox, Massachusetts, in the cemetery that adjoins the Church on the Hill, which is somewhat a landmark out there in Lenox. And she's buried next to her second husband, the Reverend Thomas Davies. You can notice on the right-hand side that Anna has a very plain grave marker, which is a little surprising to me. And it says Anna Morton Thayer, wife of Thomas Frederick Davies, and it gives the dates. And to me, it seems a bit odd that she doesn't mention anything else about her Patton connections. So don't know about that. This is a picture of Edgecombe in its later years. I went out there back in 2009 to do some research, and this is all I found. At the time, it was all boarded up. It was on the kind of in the backyard of a new healthcare facility. And I went back in 2011, and the entire place was completely demolished. So sometimes those old houses are salvaged, and sometimes they just completely disappear. And here's now a picture of Susan Mary and Bill Patton looking very stylish back there in Paris in 1952. And now I want to tell you the rest of the story. The rest of the story, as was related by that young little boy, Billy, in the carriage from the previous pictures. He's now an adult. He wrote a book about that story. Now, this goes back to the days when Bill Patton, through his connections, got a diplomatic job over in London. Okay, so when he was mixing over there with the people in the diplomatic corps and some of the people in the inner circle toward Winston Churchill, he met a couple. And the couple were the Coopers, Lady Diana Manners, who married Alfred Duff Cooper. They were in that inner circle of friends along with the Pattons. And here's a picture of Duff Cooper with Winston Churchill himself back in 1947. So you can see he was a very well-connected political person. And there's a picture of the two men together. They were lifetime friends, longtime friends. Bill Patton on the left and Duff Cooper, who is on the right-hand side. They're in Venice at the time. And part of the story is here. We don't know whether Bill Patton ever found out the truth about what happened. But he was not the father of young Billy. Instead, it was his best friend, or one of his best friends, Duff Cooper. Now, this was not commonly known, and Bill Third, who wrote the book, didn't find out until he was 47 years old. Now, apparently, it was quite common for these people in that inner circle to have affairs, the wives with the husbands and the husbands with the wives, and then they'd go back and have their formal marriage. But it was understood that occasionally there would be a little bit of an aberration or a little dalliance or a little affair on the side, quite commonly done. So here's Bill, this young, what he thought was his own, very own son, Billy. And there, I believe in France at the time, he was sent to France also on one of his diplomatic jobs. And he passed away. His health, as I said, was not poor. He was asthmatic. It was not good. It was always poor. He was asthmatic and passed away at the age of 59 in 1960. We don't know if he ever knew the truth about his son. And here is Susan Mary. And you can see she has a very curious look about her face. I don't know whether I trust her completely or not. She has her hair beautifully styled. And a little anecdotal thing about that was she said she always had to have an immaculate appearance because she never knew if she might be called to the White House that day. Now, she had moved back to Washington, D.C., and she had married who was at the time a Washington power broker. His name was Joseph Alsop. And she had a lot of hostessing skills and was a people person and very well liked. And in fact, she was on the Kennedys' inner circle too. Susan Mary's was the only private home the Kennedys visited on inauguration night. President Kennedy-elect stopped by for a bowl of terrapin soup. And then the ending of her life. Susan Mary lived a good life. She eventually divorced Alsop, but continued to live on. And she thought so much of Lancaster that when she passed, she made provision for some of her ashes to be put into the cemetery plot with the Pattons in Lancaster. So that is in the North Village Cemetery. And her first husband, Bill, his marker is there on the left. And then her ashes would be interred with this marker on the right. And this is the Patton family plot in the North Village Cemetery. It adjoins another Thayer family plot that's not too far away. So they chose to have their remains in Lancaster. And this is a picture of the book on the left-hand side. The book is called My Three Fathers, written by Bill Patton III. He's pictured there on the bottom. And he gives a complete picture of the life and times of his mother and all of those three fathers. His biological father, his official father, who passed away early, and then his stepfather. And he was drawn into the circles of the world of each one. So he was back and forth between Europe as a young man and exposed to many things that a lot of the rest of us would not be so. So he shared his story with us all in the book. And if you're interested in that sort of thing, it's a pretty nice read. And now we're going to get to the very final chapter of the story. And this is of the three daughters. This is Sally or Sarah Winthrop. Sally Thayer Winthrop. And there's a picture of her, that youngest child, and as an adult. And here she is with her new stepmother, Pauline Revere Thayer. And through her growing up years in the newspapers and the social registers and columns and things that were written, she was referred to as the prettiest girl in Boston. Quite a compliment. And here we have a story of her marriage. I'm going to talk about she married a man named Frederick Bayard Winthrop. He's pictured on the right-hand side. And just a little backstory on Frederick. For him, it would be a second marriage. His first marriage had been to a beautiful young woman, as pictured on the left-hand side. Her name was Dorothy Amory, and it was someone he had pursued for a long time and finally won her hand. And they married in 1903. They had 3 children, and then in 1907, Dorothy was killed in a very tragic horseback riding accident. And this completely devastated Fred Winthrop. And when he married Sally, which we'll talk about in a minute, he did one thing that probably would always be there in his mind as a reminder. He had a picture of Dorothy in the entryway of the home. And then he had below that in a vase, a red rose. And the red rose is a single red rose, and replaced each and every day a fresh one would be put there as a memorial to his first wife. And I believe he was devoted to her to the point where he'd never truly loved another woman. So anyway, that's the situation with his first marriage. And then enter Sally Thayer, who became Sally Thayer Winthrop. The couple married in July of 1911. So there she is in her wedding attire with her new groom. And here she is as an instant stepmother once again. Fred had those 3 children from his first marriage. And his first mother-in-law, Grandma Amory, said, "I feel very happy for Fred to think that the children will have a kind friend, for everyone praises Sally. And oh, I wish Sally had had a chance to be a loving stepmother." However, Fred, being the person he was, put some conditions on the household, and he prescribed that his children were to be raised completely separately from any children he had with Sally. So his 3 children were raised on a separate floor of the house, and Sally's 3 children that they had were raised on a separate floor. So this is kind of not a very good setting for a loving togetherness between family members. Here's Sally with her 3 children of her own. She had John, baby Catherine, and then Nathaniel. Here's a picture of her with the young son, John, that tragically died as just a young 2-year-old. Baby picture on the other side as well. And here she is with her 2 surviving children, Nathaniel and Catherine, in a little bit later time. And they're a little bit more grown up. And here's Catherine, yet as a young woman. Interestingly enough, she was a very athletic young woman, and she became a tennis star in her own time. And here she's pictured over in Wimbledon back in 1942. And after Sally was by herself, she moved to a place up in Manchester by the sea. It's up on the north shore of Massachusetts, which is known as Massachusetts Gold Coast. And here's a picture of the house. The house was situated very close to a place that's called Singing Beach. And of course, Singing Beach, because it has that squeaky, singing white sand. And that must be a nanny with someone's grandchild there, pictured. And here is the family of Nathaniel Winthrop, Sally's son, in his later years when he had a complete family, a large family there. Winthrop is a very famous name in Boston circles because they date all the way back to the very founding of the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630, when John Winthrop, their ancestor, became the first governor of that colony. Here's a picture of Sally, not looking very happy. She seems to have a permanent sad look on her face, I would say. She was killed tragically in a car accident back in 1938, which is very sad, but that's what happened. And she was just 53 years old at the time. Now, all of the information, much of the information that I got on Sally's family came from the book that's pictured on the left-hand side of the screen. It was published back in 1998. It's the story of Sally's stepdaughter, Dorothy. And Dorothy kept a lot of diaries, and she wrote a lot of letters, which she kept, and she took notes, and she had recollections, which were then gathered by her daughter, whose name was Dorothy Bradford Wexler. This would be Sally's step-granddaughter, and she wrote that book back then. And when I was doing my research years and years ago, I got a hold of Mrs. Wexler, spoke with her on the phone, and she agreed to send me some of the pictures that were from the book. So I was very fortunate to be able to get some of that information from her. And once again, if you want a picture of upper crust living on the North Shore, read this book because it gives a wonderful snapshot of their lives there. And now we've come to the end of today's presentation, part 3. And I would say I'd like to thank you all for your attention. And I do hope that you'll join me again next month when we present part 4 of this 7-part series. So right now, I'd like to say goodbye, and I hope to see you soon. Thank you.